Hello, very beautiful community. Let's look at a video by Brendan Miller, which a lot of you have sent my way, about how Trump has supposedly destroyed the populist right. It's a theme that's shot out quite a bit on YouTube. You've been asking me a lot of questions about it recently. I've just been with a lot of, not shame, not guilt, but a lot of, I think, frustration going through my Patreon comments and other messaging, which pile into hundreds. Frustration being that I'm so slow to respond for health reasons. But certainly on Patreon, I always try to get there. Now, a lot of you have sent me this video. It's perhaps the leading of the recent videos that shot out with the theme, is Trump harming the global populist right? So what I have done is I've skimmed it, then I watched the first half properly. Now we together are going to watch the second half properly. But I think I'll cut out bits of politicians speaking and focus just more on what Brendan Miller is saying. Now, who is Brendan? Brendan's a young man from East London, it looks like. I've only discovered him through your messages to me. And I think he's worked in TV, he's worked in production, he knows how to put together a very good video. What's interesting is actually that for a lot of people, the transition from TV work to YouTube is really hard. So very impressed with how well he's doing. It's very difficult to get 1 million views on YouTube. You might say, well, no, anyone can do it, just in front of the camera and speak. No, it's hard. It's a bit like, walking into somebody's studio who's doing wood carvings and you say, yeah, I can do it too. But then you try and, oh, it's a lot harder than it looks. So there is such a thing as the craft of YouTubing. And I think from that point of view, Brendan's doing a phenomenal job. And even from a thumbnailing point of view, that's a phenomenal thumbnail. So thumbnail could be terrible or brilliant. I think it's brilliant. But now Brendan's going to have his presentation looked at by a political philosopher and a political analyst, which means that it could go very badly for Brendan, but we're going to be gentle and understand also that, explainer videos have a limit in how much depth they should, be required to reach. Right? Mise en place in place. Tuck yourselves in. Let's get rolling.
Now, the news and polls will change, but I think what we're seeing right now is deeper than this particular moment. It's a problem at the level of ideas. You see, however warm this international populist movement, there was, hidden under the surface, a contradiction. I've talked on this channel before about how there are different types of nationalism. For along with ethno-cultural nationalism, often associated with persecuting minorities and war, this isn't the only option. I, for example, feel something closer to a civic kind of nationalism, a love and attachment of the country I live in, without that meaning I want to attack or insult other countries.
So there is genuinely such a thing as civic nationalism, which we talk about a lot. I mean, we often point out how different types of nationalisms conflict in Ukraine. A civic nationalism, which says all Ukrainians are in this together, and ethno-nationalism, a kind of hyper-identity politics nationalism too. And there's genuinely a literature on liberal nationalism too. There's a book from 20 years ago by Yael Tamir on liberal nationalism, which was a PhD that Isaiah Berlin supervised. So that's a thing.
A reason why I'm drawn to this kind of nationalism is reciprocity, an idea at the heart of philosophical liberalism. If we want freedom of religion, then we have to give that freedom to others.
Is reciprocity an idea at the heart of philosophical liberalism? I mean, it's certainly not illegal to say that. It's not a word you're going to find much in the great texts. The problem you've got is that reciprocity is a universal human concept. You can't have any human collective action without that concept. What I think is distinctive about liberalism is that it's going to say everybody counts equally politically and morally. So, not necessarily recommending it, but if you wanted to go with the tag of reciprocity, you might want to say something like inclusive reciprocity or equal reciprocity.
If we want freedom of speech, we can't restrict that freedom to ourselves. And if we want respect for our country's sovereignty and borders, then we have to respect it in others. But of course, Donald Trump is no liberal. He has no principled respect for the idea.
That's not much of a part of the liberal tradition. There's very, very little indeed on relations between states in the history of Western liberalism. I mean, it's really an extraordinary cultural conversations about relations between individuals mediated by institutions they share within a state.
No liberal. He has no principled respect for the ideas of sovereignty and borders. If he believed in these principles, he wouldn't insult Canadian national.
Don't need to be a liberal to have respect for sovereignty and borders, but being a liberal, whatever that means, is one way of having such respect, although that's not guaranteed either if we look at the extraordinary actions, on the international stage of the West that's engaged in questionable wars of choice in recent history.
Identity at its most basic level. He wouldn't talk about taking over Greenland, and he'd be angry about Putin's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, if you think the World Economic Forum is an attack on national sovereignty, what about an invasion that's trying to wipe your country off the map? Populists around the world famously disdain liberalism.
Really good presentation. It's just such a lovely tempo. It's extremely clear. I mean, this is really well over 1 million subscriber YouTube content as YouTubing goes.
What about an invasion that's trying to wipe your country off the map? Populists around the world famously disdain liberalism, but at the same time it seems they had a liberal expectation that Trump would respect their countries as they respected the US. Instead, they got an egocentric power trip, which quite understandably voters have rejected, leaving populist ideas in these countries tarnished as a result. So that's reason one. Nationalism without liberal reciprocity falls apart and becomes just aggression, which unsurprisingly voters reject.
Okay, let's try this. Illiberal nationalism is just aggression which voters reject. Illiberal nationalism is just aggression. That's not just a misunderstanding of nationalism or liberalism or illiberal politics. It's a misunderstanding of all politics to say that. Because the birth of politics, if you like genealogically, occurs when humans for the first time make a distinction in one way or another among themselves between appropriate and inappropriate exercise of power. Politics occurs when humans begin for the first time, and this would have happened with the mere semblance of collective coexistence. This would have been an age-old social development. And it would have occurred when humans needed to negotiate something for the first time, and they collectively engaged in distinction making, often in a conflictive way, right, about what's the difference between simply power exercise and power that's somehow not just power but authority. So it's a distinction between okayish and less okayish, reasonable and less reasonable, appropriate and less appropriate. These words are just placeholders. Exercise of power. So the idea that you lose that distinction when you step out of liberalism is ludicrous, because you can't lose that distinction at all as long as you're talking about politics. Now, obviously, illiberal nationalism and various kinds of other illiberal politics don't have to be aggressive. That's a contingent thing. And if you look at the last book by John Rawls, for example, the Laws of People, is not one of Rawls's greatest works. But what he tries to explore there is something that sort of lay outside of the range of application of his earlier work with the theory of justice and political liberalism. That John Rawls is, whatever you think of him, one of the most important liberal political thinkers of the 20th century. He tried to explore in that book what really was, as he would have said, outside of the range of application of his earlier theories. And that's how states relate. And he wanted to present a conception, among other things, of what it means to be a legitimate state that's not a liberal state. So he wanted to detach the idea of being a liberal state from the idea of being a legitimate state. So even one of the greatest, least recent liberal thinkers certainly wouldn't have thought that illiberal nationalism is just aggression. Which voters reject? Well, which bitter voters reject? I mean, they're certainly rejecting when their politicians are complicit in their countries being beaten up by Trump's misbehavior. But from that, it certainly doesn't follow that they're rejecting illiberal nationalism or illiberalism. Perhaps more on that in a second. So that, I mean, how shall we put it? That claim is not even wrong. It's just conceptual porridge.
The second way Donald Trump has caused problems for populists in other countries is best explained by looking at my country, the UK. Nigel Farage, the leader of the right-wing party Reform UK, loves Donald Trump, and Trump's election victory gave his party extra momentum. But listen to Nigel Farage more recently.
I'm not a populist.
Which one do you like?
I'm not a populist.
I've heard you call yourself a populist.
I've realised I'm not.
The reason for this change is similar to what's been happening elsewhere. Trump's actions have been unpopular. As well as talk of tariffs, there was the attack on Zelensky in Ukraine, who most in the UK see as a war hero. And JD Vance's dismissal of the UK as a random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years also went down badly, with many pointing out that UK soldiers fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. All this would be bad news for Nigel Farage at any time, but it's worse because Farage is currently trying to move his party away from the extremes in order to increase its support. If you zoom out, it seems like the international nature of the populist movement and the outsized influence of Donald Trump is making it harder for populists in other countries to actually win power. So there's the second reason. Trump's movement has made populist supporters more extreme in a way that's undermining their electoral chances.
So Trumpism has made populist voters more extreme in a way that undermines their electoral chances. Got an oxygen reset, beautiful community. Let's reflect on this. It's absolutely right that when Trump's doing bad things to your country, you're going to be less favorable to political forces in your country that align with Trump. And the reckless but immensely catastrophically consequential buffoonishness of the Trump administration has also put some people off, including some populist right voters. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, just reflect on the fact that in my analysis, Trump did not talk through with his team because he couldn't, and they couldn't bring it up properly with him, the consequences of the tariffs. So they're dealing with an inevitable consequence that they couldn't properly discuss because the calamity that Trump's doing to the world is replicated inside the Trump administration. That's right. It doesn't follow from that any basic historical tendency has been reset. The tendency we're living through is an enormous crisis of trust in institutions driven by various social forces, which we'll probably mention in a second. So quite certainly populist right voters who vote for anti-democratic populist right forces are going to pause and have a second thought. But it's not clear that they're going to be reset out of a corrosive distrust of political institutions, reset out of a corrosive distrust and sense of unsafety and betrayal and opacity in how they see or can't see what technocratic centrist politics is doing everywhere. Technocratic centrist politics does not have an answer to this. So there is nothing here to indicate even a medium-term departure from anti-democratic right populism, because everything that's by way of historical tendency put in place remains untouched. Now, it's also worth saying that we should resist the idea that the machinations inside the Reform Party in the UK are largely a product of the Trump administration's actions. The conflicts inside Reform were going on anyway. It is true that there are certain kinds of extremism that Nigel Farage himself is resisting, while himself remaining a post-truth populist of a Trumpian kind, right? That's still the case. But it's also worth observing that at this time, the Conservative Party in the UK with Kemi Badenoch is, if anything, moving toward the anti-democratic populist right discourse. So, yes, we admit the bump, we admit the challenge, but it certainly doesn't follow that what these populations in the West are going to ask for is not anti-democratic right populism. They're just going to ask for an anti-democratic right populism that doesn't fluff its lines around Trump if Trump's attacking one country.
In the final way in which Trump is ruining populism, we need to consider the different ways ideas can affect politics. You see, when we think about ideas, we often think about their merits, whether they are convincing or not. But ideas can also have impact by just being popular or giving the sense that they are winning.
What a good feeling. We like winning, don't we, huh?
In other words, an idea's power can come not just from its merits because it's convincing, but from its prestige, the sense that it's an influential winning idea.
So that's quite right. The social power of an idea is not the same thing as how good an idea that is. A lot of very bad ideas have great social power, and a lot of very good ideas have very little social power. And you know that the extremity of this is to be found in authoritarian regimes where the very fact of having a good idea might ensure that it has very little social power. Having a good idea in Belarus will actually mean you get taken away in the middle of the night.
When Trump won, populism seemed to be what Hegel called the Geist der Zeiten, the spirit of the times, or Zeitgeist. And this had political consequences.
It's a little bit embarrassing, but it's actually good YouTubing to give that twang. A more digestive approach, of course, would have us ask, what do we actually mean when we talk about zeitgeist? And is the way we talk about it constructive, or does it actually evade certain kinds of reflectiveness that we might badly need? And it's interesting to see whether that is not a problem that manifests in this video.
For example, look at all the business leaders that switched to Trump and conservative positions when he won. Some of this might have been genuine, but it was also driven by a sense that Trump's ideas were in the ascendancy, and that if they didn't get on board, they were going to lose out. But Trump's actions since winning power have started to undo this sense of dominance by, well, being incompetent and unrealistic. But when Trump lets Musk blow up his own government's ability to do things, or goes back and forth on trade policies, at one point switching rates twice in a single day, or suggests nonsense ideas about America taking over Gaza without any soldiers, all while presiding over an economy starting to crash, the whole thing seems less like the winning thing and more like a movement that's going to blow up under its own contradictions, incompetence, and inability to understand reality. One parallel might be the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020, that went from being at the heart of the zeitgeist, an idea that everyone, from normies on social media to business interests, rushed to accommodate themselves to, and then developed into a set of ideas that were rejected even by many of the people they aimed to help. Putting aside the merits of these ideas, you can see how ideas can have a kind of prestige that rises or falls, and this has consequences for their impact. And that's what I think we will see increasingly with Trump: chaos and incompetence that will damage the prestige and impact of populism around the world. Now, of course, there's about a million things we could say at this point. Trump is still in power, the Canadian Conservatives might still win, and UK voters largely didn't notice the infighting within Reform. And of course, the decline of populism has been predicted before. But while I don't expect populism and its ideas to disappear, I think we are seeing some of the shine come off them, as these ideas make contact, as all political ideas do, with the messiness of reality.
Well, Trump's certainly having a car crash of a time, making contact with reality constructively. Here is the basic point that's really important to understand. Ideas are, to a good extent, a product of various social forces, especially ideas in politics. Ideas in the academy, ideas that philosophers come up with, can have a degree of detachment from the current cultural context. Not complete detachment. Ideas are still produced by the culture. They're then spat back out into the culture that transforms the culture, which then transforms again possibilities for new ideas. And on that circle goes. The causal arrow here between ideas and practice goes in both directions. But fundamentally, whatever we might call a zeitgeist here cannot change the fundamental social forces at play that have for years and decades been driving us into a situation we're in now, which is an early onset situation of democratic decline, right? So it's not that there's an option here for history to revert back. The only option is to accept the fact that the anti-democratic populist wave will only grow, that in the 2030s we're going to get competent authoritarians instead of the buffoons we've often got in the 2020s. That's because of a profound crisis of trust driven by social forces. Trust emotionally expressed as a feeling of not just powerlessness and unsafety and betrayal, but a kind of sense of opacity of all institutions. A sense of opacity that is terrifying because once voters land in it, they want to destroy their political institutions because they seem unintelligible to them. And for all of the decency and integrity you find in centrist technocratic politics, that kind of politics has no answers today and cannot have answers until it begins to ask extremely serious questions about itself that it is entirely unready to ask. Questions like, what is it about the Clinton period, the Obama period, and so on that produced Trump? So these social forces include the state of the internet and social media, or segregation into tiny bubbles of mental and fact worlds. It includes the profound atomization of social bonds in our society. It includes deep sense of economic deprioritization and resentment at the kind of hyper-globalization that took place in the 80s and 90s, which voters feel that it both disadvantaged them and was done without them being asked about it. There are various ideologies of authenticity, of self-realization, of the kind that Brendan mentions there briefly with BLM, that are enterprises that do not have recourse to the basic concepts on which democracy depends, which is public good, solidarity. So the idea that any zeitgeist shift can change these social forces is a non-starter. It's not unlikely, it's impossible. Failing to understand that is failing to understand what an historical tendency is. So I think that's one central observation. Another observation is that there's a kind of perhaps inadvertent post-truth effect to the video, namely that Brendan does not say that we're going to revert back to a normal, in quote marks. Brendan doesn't even say that that's possible. But I think for a lot of viewers, the effect of the video is to give reassurance that there can be a swing back to normality at a time when normality has in fact been irreversibly consigned to the past, because normality is a delimited and very contingent historical bubble, which we've now transcended and is now behind us. And algorithms are, and I can feel this on the back end of YouTube, dramatically pushing YouTube creators to give a kind of Fukuyamian reassurance that we can revert back to where we've come from, right? If you can give that to you, beautiful community, you're gonna get views on the platform. I'm very conscious of that being where the algorithm is pushing us. That's not Brendan's fault, that post-truth effect, but it is interesting that the effect of the video is to incline people in a direction of an image that's actually not part of the video itself, but it is an effect that the video has. So how do we sum this up? Brilliant YouTubing, phenomenal YouTubing, million subscriber level YouTubing. Analysis and concepts quite shallow, but fundamentally, a mature reaction is to understand that Trumpism can and is on course to implode eventually, but that says nothing about the implosion of authoritarian politics in the West. Trumpism has dramatically disinhibited authoritarian anti-democratic forces in the West and will act as an accelerator for these forces, even in countries that are somewhat mobilizing against Trumpism, like Canada. That's an historical tendency driven by social forces, which are actually positioning us only at the start of something that's going to grow, an anti-democratic wave that's in early onset now that's going to grow. The idea that it won't grow is just a kind of historical impossibility given the predicament that we're in and are going to stay in over the next couple of decades. So it's time to button up the hatches and get clear that we need to be clear-sighted, that we need to resist, that we need to not preemptively concede and obey, and that when our democracy is being detethered from truthful discourse, we have to be more arrogant, confident and arrogant than ever in insisting that unless you go about calling things what they are, you're just not going to have a democracy. So hope, possibility for transformation, indeed some possibilities for democratic regeneration are there too, but fundamentally the wave will grow and no zeitgeists blowing about in the wind can fundamentally alter that. Lots of love.